Hey everyone, welcome back. We love to dive deep into large language models and their potential in healthcare.
And today we've got a really interesting one.
Yeah, this research paper is about uh, building a more trustworthy LLM, kind of like an AI physician, and they're calling it Med-R2,
It's really all about taking what we know about how AI doctors can be used for diagnosis and adding that extra layer of evidence-based reasoning, like what a human doctor would use.
like a real doctor. Yeah. So
Ah,
imagine, an AI that could go through all this medical research and weigh the evidence and come up with a diagnosis, just like a human expert.
exactly.
That's kind of the ultimate goal,
That's
right?
the dream, isn't it?
Yeah.
But, there are some pretty big challenges when it comes to using LLMs for medicine. Like,
Well, for sure.
you've probably seen in your own research, it costs a lot to train these things.
Yeah.
The data can get outdated quickly.
Totally.
And getting those precise answers from medical literature, it's not easy.
It's tough. Yeah. And the paper even mentions how these LLMs, they often need massive data sets for training.
Huge E.
And it's like finding a needle in a haystack, trying to find accurate information sometimes.
Absolutely. And that's where this new system, this Med-R2, comes in.
Okay.
And get this, it's based on something we all use every day, whether we know it or not.
Okay.
Evidence-based medicine, or EBM.
Wait, EBM. I thought that was like super technical doctor stuff.
Well, yeah, at its heart, it is. It's how doctors use studies and research to make the best choices for their patients.
All right.
But you use it too. Like when you're choosing a new phone or picking a restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
You're gathering evidence, reading reviews, comparing different options.
I guess you're right.
It's all about making an informed choice. So Med-R2 is bringing that same approach into the AI world.
So how does Med-R2 actually do that? Like bring EBM into AI?
Well, think of it this way. Med-R2 is like a digital detective. It follows a trail of evidence.
Okay, I like that.
Just like a human doctor would when they're using EBM.
I see. So the paper also talked about this thing called the evidence hierarchy pyramid.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Oh, yes, the hierarchy of evidence.
Yeah.
That's a key part of EBM. It's
Mhm.
all about ranking the different types of medical information based on how reliable they are.
Mhm.
It helps us figure out which evidence we can really trust and what might not be as strong.
So like a ranking system for medical information.
Exactly. At the very top of the pyramid, you have things like systematic reviews.
Okay.
Those are basically studies of studies.
Wow.
They look at data from lots of different sources, and they're considered the gold standard.
So those are the most reliable.
Absolutely. Then you have things like randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, case reports.
Gotcha.
And way down at the bottom, you have things like expert opinions, which can be valuable,
Sure.
but they might be a bit more biased.
Right. I see. So how does Med-R2 use this pyramid? Like in practice?
Well, it uses the hierarchy to decide which evidence to focus on when it's trying to diagnose something or answer a question. The higher up on the pyramid, the more Med-R2 trusts that evidence. It's all about making sure the AI is giving you solid advice based on the most reliable information possible.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's break down how Med-R2 actually works. The paper talks about 4 main stages, right?
Mm.
The first one being question formulation.
Yes, exactly. And that stage is all about making sure that the AI really understands what it's being asked. Just like a good doctor who would make sure to clarify your symptoms and concerns, Med-R2 needs to figure out what kind of information it needs to find.
Okay, so it's like figuring out if it's a question about a diagnosis, a treatment, or something else.
Exactly. The paper actually goes deeper, saying that Med-R2 breaks the question down even further.
Oh, wow.
It puts it into categories like diagnosis, treatment, prognosis, even things like the cost of care.
Wow.
And it figures out if it's a factual question, a request for steps in a procedure, even a hypothetical scenario.
So it's like analyzing the question from all these different angles. Why is that so important?
Well, it helps to make the search for information much more precise. For example, the paper gives this great example. If you ask, what are the signs of Marburg virus?
Okay.
Med-R2 might rephrase that as, what are the diagnostic criteria for Marburg virus disease, and what clinical symptoms and lab results indicate this diagnosis?
So it's basically like taking everyday language and translating it into something more medically specific.
Exactly. It's like having a super smart medical librarian built right into the system,
That's really cool.
making sure you're asking the right questions to get the right information.
Okay, that makes sense. So the AI has now figured out the question. What happens next?
Well, then we move on to evidence searching and appraising, where things get really interesting. This is where the real detective work begins.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this stage.
All right, so this is where Med-R2 goes into that massive medical knowledge base we talked about.
Okay.
Millions of articles, textbooks, guidelines. It's a treasure trove of medical information.
Wow, that sounds almost overwhelming. How does it even begin to search through all of that?
It uses this clever approach called coarse to fine. So it starts with broad searches using the keywords from your question.
Okay, so it starts broad, then what?
As it finds potential leads, it narrows down the search, getting more and more specific. Imagine you start with a search for headache, then you narrow it to headache with fever and stiff neck, and then finally, headache with fever, stiff neck, and day sensitivity to light, which could suggest meningitis.
Ah, I get it. It's like using filters to narrow down your results online.
Exactly. And to make sure that it's not missing anything important, Med-R2 actually combines a few different types of retrieval methods.
That's really thorough. What happens after it's gathered all that potential evidence?
Well, then it brings back that evidence hierarchy pyramid. Remember that.
Yep.
It uses that ranking system to decide which evidence is the most trustworthy and relevant to the question. It might even find conflicting information from different sources. In that case, it knows to prioritize evidence from higher up in the pyramid, just like a human doctor would.
So it's not just blindly trusting everything it finds, it's actually evaluating the quality of the information.
That's right. It's analyzing the evidence, weighing its credibility, and making judgments about what to trust, just like a human expert would.
That's really impressive. It really sounds like it's mirroring the way a human expert thinks.
It is.
So now that Med-R2 has all this evidence that it's ranked, what's the next step?
That brings us to stage 3, which is where it starts to feel like this AI is really thinking. We call it evidence applying.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about what happens in that stage.
Well, we'll dive into that in part 2 of this deep dive. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we left off with Med-R2 with, this big pile of ranked evidence.
Right.
What happens next? It's time for evidence applying. This is where the AI starts to, like, flex its mental muscles.
Oh, it does. It really does.
I'm really excited to hear more about this.
Yeah, this is the heart of the system, you know?
Yeah.
Remember how we were talking about evidence-based medicine, EBM? It's more than just looking things up.
Right.
It's about actually using reasoning
Right.
to apply the knowledge to a specific situation. And that's exactly what Med-R2 is doing in this stage.
So it's not just spitting out data, it's actually trying to understand and use it.
Exactly.
Okay.
The paper calls this chain of thought reasoning.
Okay.
And it's really designed to kind of mimic how a human doctor thinks through a problem.
Right.
So instead of just giving you a one-word answer, you know, like yes or no,
Yeah.
Med-R2 actually builds this logical sequence of steps
Okay.
to arrive at its conclusion.
So, like, if I asked it about a certain set of symptoms,
Right.
it wouldn't just say, you might have X.
Exactly. It would say something more like, given symptom A and symptom B, and considering that they often occur together in condition Y,
Okay.
further investigation is needed.
I see.
You know, it's laying out the reasoning step by step.
That's so cool. It's like, it's showing its work, but for, like, a medical diagnosis.
Yeah.
Does that help with trust, do you think?
I think so, because one of the biggest challenges with using AI in healthcare is this black box problem.
Right.
You don't know how the AI reached its conclusion,
Right.
but with Med-R2, you can actually see the thought process, which can be really reassuring for doctors and patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got this AI that can understand the question,
Right.
find the evidence,
Yep.
and then reason through it like a human expert.
Mhm.
What happens in the final stage? Effect assessment.
Right.
Is this like a final quality control check?
You got it.
Okay.
This is where Med-R2 is checking itself.
Okay.
It looks at the answers that it's come up with and makes sure that they really line up with the evidence and the reasoning that it's used.
Okay.
It's like having a built-in second opinion.
Yeah.
Making sure everything is consistent and accurate.
So it's not just assuming that it's right. It's actually double checking its work.
Exactly. And it goes even further.
Oh, wow.
It looks at how stable its evidence retrieval process was. Like, is it consistently finding the most relevant and reliable information?
I see.
It's really about that trustworthiness, right?
I'm starting to see why they're calling this a more trustworthy LLM physician. It's like it has all these safeguards built in.
It does.
But how did it actually perform compared to other systems? Was all this effort worth it?
Well, that's the real question, right?
Yeah.
And the researchers put Med-R2 through a bunch of tests. They compared it to LLMs with no extra knowledge.
Okay.
LLMs fine-tuned on medical data,
Uh-huh.
and even another similar RD system. But this one was using the same knowledge base as Med-R2, so it was a fair comparison.
It sounds like they really wanted to challenge this new system. So what were the results?
Well, first of all, Med-R2 consistently did better than the LLMs that were just answering questions based on their initial training.
Okay, so just having access to all that extra medical information gave it a big advantage.
It did. It really shows the power of using an external knowledge base.
Right. What about the models that were specifically fine-tuned on medical data? Those seem like they'd be tougher competition.
You would think right.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Med-R2 performed almost as well as those fine-tuned models, and in some cases, even better.
Wait, hold on. It did better than models that were specifically trained on medical information. How is that possible?
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
The researchers think it comes down to this powerful combination of a really good knowledge base with those sophisticated reasoning abilities.
Okay.
So it's not just about what you know, it's also about how you use it.
That's interesting. So it's not just memorizing medical facts, it's actually understanding and applying them in a way that mimics human reasoning.
Exactly. And that has huge implications because, fine-tuning a large language model on medical data, that's expensive. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
But Med-R2 is showing us that there might be a more efficient, more cost-effective way to get those same results, or even better.
Wow. That's a game changer. It could make medical AI more accessible to researchers who don't have tons of resources.
Absolutely. And it also brings up some really interesting questions about the relationship between model size, context window, and reasoning ability.
Okay, remind me about context window again.
Sure, think of it like the AI's short-term memory.
Okay.
It's how much information it can hold in its mind at once.
Got it.
And not surprisingly, the study found that bigger models generally performed better.
Right, makes sense.
But what's really interesting is that they found that the optimal length of the context window actually increased as the model size got bigger.
So bigger models need a bigger scratch pad to work with.
Yeah, exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. They found that pushing the smaller models to use that chain of thought reasoning too early could actually make them perform worse.
Oh, wow. So it's like they need to build up a certain level of understanding before they can do the really complex thinking.
It seems that way. It's like trying to have a deep conversation with someone before they've had their coffee.
Yeah, I get it.
It looks like smaller models might need to kind of digest the information first, build that foundation before they can jump into the reasoning.
So even with AI, sometimes it's about taking things one step at a time.
Right.
This whole idea of an AI thinking like a human is so fascinating. What else did the researchers learn about Med-R2?
Well, we'll get into that in part 3 of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Okay, so Med-R2 is doing amazingly well in these tests.
It is.
Even beating out models specifically trained on medical data. Are we like on the verge of replacing doctors with AI?
Well, not so fast. This research is really still in those early stages.
Yeah.
It's definitely showing us that there's potential here.
Yeah.
But Med-R2 is not quite ready to hang up its stethoscope just yet.
Okay, that makes sense. What are some of the limitations that they found?
Well, one of the big ones is that Med-R2, it's only as good as the information in its knowledge base.
Right.
So if the knowledge base isn't complete or it's out of date,
Yeah.
the AI could make mistakes.
Right.
Keeping that massive database updated with all the latest medical research, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. Medical knowledge is constantly changing and new discoveries are being made all the time. It's like, expecting a doctor to give you the best treatment using textbooks from like 50 years ago.
Exactly. And, the researchers pointed out a couple of other things. They said that their query classifier,
Hmm.
the part that figures out, what the medical question is about,
Right.
that's not perfect yet.
So there's still room for improvement in like how the AI understands what we're actually asking.
Right. And they also used a simplified model
Okay.
to try to estimate how useful a piece of evidence was when it was ranking them.
Right.
And that might not always reflect how the main LLM would use the information.
Okay. So it sounds like there's still some things to figure out,
There are.
but it feels like we're moving closer to this vision of AI and doctors working together
I think so too.
to make healthcare better.
This research is really exciting because it gives us a possible roadmap for building that trust, that
Yeah.
reliability into medical AI. It's not about replacing doctors. It's about giving them a powerful new tool.
It's like, those early prototypes of self-driving cars.
Mhm.
They weren't perfect at first,
Right.
but they laid the foundation for what we have today. And it feels like Med-R2 could be that same kind of turning point for AI in medicine.
I agree. And, just like with self-driving cars, the key is to keep testing, keep refining, keep learning. As AI in healthcare continues to evolve, it's so important for all of us to stay informed and be a part of that conversation.
That's such a great point. So as we wrap up our deep dive into AI and healthcare today, what are some things that stand out to you? What are your hopes or maybe some concerns about the future of AI in medicine?
Well, it is a fascinating field with so much potential.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of really important questions that we need to think about.
Yeah.
And I really encourage you to think about what role you want AI to play in your own healthcare journey.
That's a good point.
Would you trust an AI with your medical information? What questions would you ask an AI physician?
Yeah.
Keep exploring these questions because the future of healthcare is happening right now.
That's a great note to end on. This has been such an insightful look at Med-R2
It has.
and what AI could mean for the future of medicine. Thanks for joining us today, and keep exploring the possibilities.